Welcome to our presentation of the 2003 Northeast Blackout. In August of 2003, a major blackout occurred, affecting Ottawa, Cleveland, New York City, and surrounding areas. This blackout left 50 million homes without power, countless injuries, it contributed to 11 deaths, and it caused a major lack of trust in the power infrastructure. The blackout caused huge impacts in three separate areas: transportation, water, and economic. In the transportation, there were major airport delays, a whole subway system failure where passengers were required to be evacuated from underground, massive traffic jams because the traffic lights required power, citizens were told to just stay home. In water pumps require electricity, so they were inoperable, and there was no running water to major areas such as Cleveland and other places. Economic, restaurants and hotels lost billions in revenue. New York City tourists were traumatized, and cell phone service failed in large areas. So how did this happen? Well, the trees caused the original line fault, which we'll talk about next. The compensating power lines were overexerted past what they were rated. Multiple line failures knocked out the generators because of phase shifts, and the cascading effect resulted in a major blackout. We'll talk about the timeline, but first, some math. Power is equal to voltage times current. The resistive losses, that is heat, is equal to current squared times the resistance in the line. When the voltage goes down, according to the first equation, the current goes up because the same power is being drawn. When the current goes up, the resistive losses, that is heat, goes way up and the line gets really hot. When the power lines get hot, they sag into the grounded trees. The power lines themselves are at 100 to 300 volts, and because the trees are grounded, planted in the ground, they're at 0 volts. This causes a huge spike in current, so when the trees touch the lines, the breakers trip to avert forest fires. That's when the line goes down, and further lines that this one's attached to also lose voltage, but there's still power being drawn off of them, so the same cycle happens. The key point here is that the trees touch the lines and the breakers trip and cause the line to go down. If the trees were trimmed, they wouldn't touch the lines, and it turns out that the lines can actually handle a voltage much higher than what they're rated, and the whole blackout could have been avoided. So here's the timeline of failures. At 3:05 p.m., the Chamberlain-Harding line, that is the line that goes from Chamberlain to Harding, fails. This causes the Star-Juniper line to compensate and becomes overloaded at 106%. First Energy, the company watching this line, doesn't notice because their software requires a manual overloading when a line fails. The same Star line also tries to compensate and overloads and heats up at this point. At 4:05, the Samus Star line fails. Because of the failures in the lines, at 4:10, there are frequency errors, and most of the generators are disconnected to avoid damage. The power from other sources is redirected to the Ohio grid, causing more lines to heat up and become overloaded, and the failure cascades, and the grid is black by 4:13 p.m.
So why did all of this happen? Ultimately, what we see is a highly interconnected set of power lines and grids that can crumble on the slightest movement. This grid operates in such a way that small local issues can cause widespread damage as other lines must take on more power, so much power that they ultimately fail. This creates an extremely sensitive and interconnected system. In addition, the men governing this system had little oversight and little they could ultimately do to prevent any problems. Finally, there was a severe lack of redundant power lines to provide power at times when one line might go down. These things boil down to two main areas of blame: the human error and a lack of regulation. From the human side, we see a failure to report issues as they occurred. Technicians were working on problems out in the field without letting their operators and in-house people know what they were working on. In addition, that day, companies happened to be upgrading their alarm system and therefore had it disabled while they installed the update. Unfortunately, the technician forgot to re-enable the alarm, and so everything went unnoticed. Similarly, employees had prioritized alarms. However, some people disabled these alarms if they were taking up too much CPU power. This is what happened to the state estimator. Finally, a last source of human error was a lack of tree trimming that created overgrown trees and caused the line to fault. In addition to human factors, we see a lack of regulation as one major fault. At this point in time, regulations were still voluntary, and there wasn't any energy commission that had the power to enforce anything. People could choose to follow the regulations if they wanted, or choose to run at dangerous levels if they felt that they could handle it. First Energy was a quickly growing company in the Ohio area that was buying and consolidating utilities faster than they could actually maintain them. Unfortunately for all those in the Northeast, First Energy had failed to trim near some of their power lines, and one of these trees caused the short. As the lines became overloaded and trouble cascaded, First Energy was left uninformed as they had turned off their state estimator and alarm system. Add a slow display that only refreshes once every 20 seconds into the mix, and you have a recipe for disaster, especially when you fail to see the other warning signs. Looking at the government report, we find 4 major faults in the system. The first fault was an inadequate system understanding. While officials acknowledged that there was a voltage instability prior to this event, the issue was not addressed, and so First Energy failed to fix it. Most technicians didn't even fully understand the system that they were working on. The next fault was an inadequate situational awareness due to the lack of alarm system and the poor display refresh rate at First Energy. Without proper tools to warn them of the situation, First Energy couldn't try and remedy the situation or even acknowledge what the situation was. Next cited was inadequate tree trimming on the part of First Energy. Finally, we have a failure to provide diagnostic support from both MISO and First Energy. Even though MISO knew that something was wrong, the two companies failed to work together to find the error and fix it before it spiraled out of control.
After an event like this, we have to ask, what could have been done differently? Well, for one, it should have been more apparent to the folks in the control room that there was an underlying issue with the alarm system. The IT folks had known for some time and had been working on fixing the problem, but in an effort to fix the problem before having to alert their superiors of it, they failed to alert people that really needed to know this at the time. Now, given this, it might have been nice to have a redundant alarm system so that with one failed, the backup alarm system would have alerted the folks in the control room that there were indeed issues on the grid. Also, perhaps having a system that didn't require human interaction to solve issues with grid overstress would have been very nice. Such a system could have seen lines with more power than they should typically carry. Also, First Energy should have simply trimmed the trees in the first place. This seems like a very simple issue compared to some of the other ones that they dealt with later on in the event. The aftermath of the Northeast blackout in 2003 resulted in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, which allowed the regulatory commissions, both the national and federal ones, to achieve real power in their duties. All power companies were forced to actually follow the regulations. Failure to do so could have resulted in major fines. In fact, Florida Power and Lighting was one of the first victims of this fine. They were fined $25 million. Over 96 new reliability standards were issued, including ones that regulated training, trimming, and the use of different tools. How could the aftermath have been handled differently? Well, one way would have been to reduce human error through mandated controller redundancy. Instead of having just First Energy look at their own control room, having another government body or company look at the same information of First Energy's grid would have allowed multiple sets of eyes to be on the same issues. This would have allowed alarm system issues to be picked up much easier. Secondly, Congress could have passed a law simply mandating that all national grid information be viewable from a single source. This would greatly simplify issues that relate to one grid, but then expand over a series of them. Also, First Energy probably should have been prosecuted for culpable negligence leading to death or injuries. Clearly there was multiple deaths that were at least partially blamed on the blackout. And because First Energy failed to properly trim the trees and did not share the alarm system information properly, I think there was some serious negligence there that could have been prosecuted. Finally, although this was not part of the aftermath, I think auditing First Energy in the future would have been a very useful tool, just to make sure that if there are voltage instability areas, we can pick them up before they become larger grid problems. Lastly, it is important to examine some of the technology improvements that could have both changed how things were handled during the event, as well as contributed to companies dealing with these sort of events differently in the future. For instance, better real-time analysis would have been key during the event. Knowing that there was a series of lines that were being overexerted and being able to counter them in real time would have been absolutely crucial to solving the problem before it became a cascading event. Another thing that would have been useful is the phase monitor units that are now more heavily implemented. These would allow different regulatory bodies to kind of look at the phases in different areas of a grid and know that phases are becoming more out of sync, and as such there is a grid issue. Finally, superconducting power lines that would have had much more capacity than those available to First Energy at the time would have likely stopped the problem, as instead of overheating and sagging into trees, these power lines would have been able to tolerate the added load. Listed on this slide are our sources for their presentation. We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much.